For this session this morning. We've got a great panel. I'll introduce actually what we're going to talk about in a second, but I'm just going to quickly run through the panel. So we've got, at the end, we've got Carlo Farino from CERN Pension Fund. Then we've got Virginie Van Dorn from Concert, Thomas Lees from Aberdeen, and Elisa Benito from Coninco. What I'd like to do, rather than just reading a bio, which is a bit dry and often happens at these kind of events, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to briefly just introduce yourself, talk about your background and your organisation. Briefly though. Actually, before I do that as well, we will save some time at the end for questions. So the format is essentially going to be an informal panel, followed with questions at the end. So if you do have questions, if we can save them towards the end. Sorry, Elisa, go for it.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Elisa Benito. I work for Coninco, Explorers in Finance. We are a small boutique in Switzerland, and we do advisory for Swiss pension funds. Myself, I have a background in environmental science and sustainable finance, and I'm in charge of ESG and sustainability for our clients and for the funds analysis.
Hello everyone, good morning. My name is Thomas Lees and I work in London for Aberdeen in the fixed income team as an investment director, and I'm one of the founders and one of the managers of our climate transition bond fund. And I also help out doing climate change research and strategy for some of the broader products we have.
Hi, Virginie Van Dorn. I'm working with Concert, a Geneva-based company. We are a pioneer in ESG verification. We're working with both asset owners and asset managers, just like Aberdeen. My background is finance. I'm coming from private equity, actually. I love this asset class, but I moved into listed asset because I think there is a huge lever here to make change.
Thank you. Carlo?
Morning, everyone. Carlo Farina. I work for the CERN Pension Fund. CERN is a European organization for nuclear research. In particular, I'm portfolio manager for real asset. And given the status of CERN, it's supranational that extends to the pension fund, we have been quite relative, I can say, atypical even for the average Swiss pension fund. We have been investing in private equity, hedge fund, in case of infrastructure, timberland, farmland, so lots of quite interesting alternative assets for 4 decades, in these 4 decades.
Perfect, thank you. I realise as well in my eagerness to start, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Dan Grandage, I'm Head of Sustainable Investing at Aberdeen. So as I mentioned, I didn't mention actually, so the title of today's seminar or panel is Climate Investments Today, Are They Doing More Harm Than Good? And that's an intentionally provocative title. And what I'd like each of you to do, starting with you, Elisa, sorry, is just perhaps bring your perspective to that. You know, are there really some strategies and activities which are doing more harm than good, or is that not true?
Thank you. I would like to think positively, so think that all strategies are born because of, good vision. But it's true that we are seeing many unexpected effects of some of these strategies. It's difficult to try to internalize an externality such as, climate change is too global, too diffuse. But I just wanted to give one example. When the European emission trading scheme started in 2005, I think, the objective was to put a price on CO2 emissions, right? So 1 ton had to have a price. We were going to give a few tons to each company, and the market is intelligent and everything was going to work out. Those polluters were going to have to buy, and the clean companies would be able to have some benefit. But then the crisis came, 2007, and the price of a ton was like 10 cents instead of 20 euros, which was meant to be. And for 10 years, I think nothing worked. And now, 15 years later, we are finally seeing the ton of CO2 at, I don't know, I think 80 or 90 euros. And we've been seeing failure for 15 years, but finally we've learned to manage this, chaos, and I think it's finally starting to pay back. So I want to think that what's not working, if we wait long enough, maybe we'll see, some good coming out of it.
Perfect, thank you. Thomas, so you're obviously run the Climate Transition Bond Fund. Can you bring to life your perspective on that, but actually perhaps talk about the role of transition within this context?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. I mean, I think I'd agree with Elisa. A lot of strategies at the moment are set up with very good intentions. So there's a lot of new climate strategies being set up. There's a lot of asset owners and asset managers that are setting net zero targets, setting interim targets. But for me, what I've experienced is that there's often a disconnect between having low carbon or climate friendly portfolios versus having low carbon in the real world. And I think that's been the heart of how we've tried to set things up at Aberdeen, particularly in the Climate Transition Bond Fund, is to think not just how can we make this a low carbon portfolio, how can we make sure that our investments are actually helping bring down emissions in the real world? So really, very happy to own high emitting companies if they're on that forward looking downward trajectory, because we think we can do more good by investing in high emitting companies today that are on that transition downwards than just investing in low carbon portfolios or low carbon companies today. So that's very much focus is trying to take that forward looking view to prioritize real world emissions. And I think that's getting quite lost in a lot of the strategies we see today. So
just to come back to the question, more harm than good. So obviously what you've just described is good. What would harm look like? How can some of these activities perhaps be more misleading?
Yeah, I think, the investment world, like a lot of industries, we want simplicity, we want something that's measurable. We're very used to assessing funds based on investment performance. It's very simple to see how a portfolio performed versus a benchmark. You just compare the two numbers. I think with climate change, we've tried to do something similar. So we just look at scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then we compare that versus the benchmark. It's very simple. You can compare a lot of funds very easily. You can set a target. But unfortunately, a lot of the low scope 1 and 2 emitting companies actually don't have that much to do with supporting us to get to net zero. A lot of the biggest climate solutions technologies, a lot of the biggest transition companies might actually have high emissions today compared to some of these low scope 1 and 2 companies. And what you're seeing is people can create quite easily a low carbon portfolio that does very little to support the investment and the capital that we need to get us to net zero.
Okay, thanks. Carlo, I'm just going to come to you. I'll come back to you, Virginie, in a second. Carlo, it'd be good to get your view.
So for me, let's say to answer your question, I would say to frame my answer. First, pragmatism is key, and we have our first, probably second-hand generation approach. So this is important to understand if we do more harm than good. In my view, without sounding overly optimistic, let's say that in Europe, we are doing more good than harm. I say Europe because in the States, more polarized, multi-side. Let's stick to in Europe, companies, investors realize that climate change is real, and so the action needed. So we have two main leverages to do good, right? Policy, carbon pricing, etc., or private investment. The funding gap is huge, and from this point of view, I believe a private asset, talking about my role of investing in private asset, can do probably more with respect to listed. I read somewhere that the gap is 110 trillion per year till 2050. And I think that this kind of technology we need transport are better funded, are brand new to start with. So typically we fund when they needed seeding or venture stage. They also typically are disruptive, but model disruptors. So typically the private equity structure could support them, could do more harm than good. And also I think why I'm optimistic that we are doing, without denying the issues, is that but typically we buy the entire company, private, or the large majority. So we are the main shareholder, we compete with less co-owner, and it's easier, should be easier to deliver a stronger activism or stewardship. which translate into delivering better real-term results, not just by sector rotation as you can do in paper. So from this point of view, I think at least private markets are doing good. There's a lot to do. I guess we can discuss later about regulation stuff, but we are doing good. There's a lot of delay, politics as well, but to answer your point, I think we are doing good.
Do you think, sorry, this isn't on the list, so sorry. Do you think we're doing enough?
We could do more. I mean, everyone needs role. I mean, regulation to start with. I mean, I welcome, I guess we can discuss later, 2 new rules, a SEC new rules, proposal about, for example, providing audible scope 1, 2, and 3 data, total transparency about certificate, reporting alongside TCFD. This is very welcome. To come back on the other side of the Atlantic, the CBAM, the carbon leakage, the new legislation view to limit carbon leakage, which basically means producing or importing from countries that have much less regulation of carbon than us. This is welcome. So we are doing, but not enough. We should do more. I mean, 2030, 2050 looks far, but it's not from this point of view.
Okay, thank you. And Virginia, you've obviously got a slightly different perspective, so it'd just be really interesting to see how how you're advising your clients to navigate this. You know, there's as we've heard, there are some strategies who are just slightly playing with numbers rather than actually having a real world outcome. It'd just be interesting if you could bring to life how you're helping your clients on this journey.
Yeah, well, Swiss pension fund, and by that I mean those who already embark on the journey, are really wanting to do something, but most of them, they don't know where to start. And they are actually fearing that they do more harm than good. And I'm afraid that for some of them, that fear is preventing them to start somewhere. So that's one of the points. But I understand why, because they are most of the time lacking the information, the kind of information, the kind of perspective you gave earlier. They are not always accessible to the investor. And probably it's easier just to measure CO2 and also set a trajectory to reduce CO2 than to really to have a larger point of view and go into, is that the right solution? Is it an energy, a fossil fuel, for instance, that is a traditional one or in transition? So that's the kind of question most of the pension funds are not able to answer by themselves. So I think where we could actually help them more is by giving them more transparency, data that they can actually compare, and information they could actually base their decision on. And that's where Conseil is helping them. But really, I think the point is about giving them the right tools to form educated decision about that.
Do you think that transition sort of story is a harder one for clients to really understand? It's easier for them to find a nice Paris-aligned benchmark portfolio. They can see what's happening, whereas the transition story is a bit of a harder sell, because you might end up, as Tom said, sometimes with high emitters within that. Do you find that, or?
I don't really like the word stories, because we're actually investing on facts, and you building your portfolio on facts. But I think they need to understand the why. And once they understand the why, they feel much more comfortable communicating with all the destinataires, because at the end they are trustee of wealth they are managing for others. And if they don't feel comfortable with the decision they are taking based on this information, they will not take it. So at the end, it's really about giving them facts they can explain and use for the decision.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Thomas, I'm just going to come to you now, and still having this kind of harm-good battle, if you like. Obviously, there's been some press, in the last sort of 6-12 months around some sort of green bonds which are potentially not as green as they might seem, or perhaps as they marketed on. How much, you're in a fixed income team, you have a bond fund. How much of an issue is this for you, but also how much focus do you need to pay towards the use of the proceeds of the bond, but also, and I think it's quite an important point, if you can talk about this as well, is actually the materiality of the bond in the context of the wider sort of parent group organisation.
Yeah, there's quite a few things to unpick there. I mean, stepping back, green bonds are a good instrument. You know, there's nothing wrong with them per se. You know, if you can link money that you're investing with a project or a specific use of proceeds, I think that's a good thing. And you know, if the instrument's used well, I think it can be a really good tool to help us, you know, allocate capital to projects that need finance. The problem is, as you say, there has been quite a bit of greenwashing in the space. I look at the real estate sector, and if you just taking an example of real estate companies, if you buy a portfolio of green labeled buildings in the center of Geneva or in any city, you can borrow money against them. 5 years later, you can then refinance that debt using a green bond and say that it's allocated to those green buildings. That money is not doing anything to improve the energy efficiency of those buildings. You're not developing anything. You're not refurbishing them. You're not actually. There's no additionality that comes with that. But you can issue a green bond just because you own something with a green label. And you can actually set that green label as low as you want. So it doesn't even have to be, you know, companies can basically set their own standards for green bonds. And what we've seen as a result is quite a lot of greenwashing. And it's similar with sustainability-linked bonds. You know, we've seen companies, there was a good Bloomberg article about a company that issued a sustainability-linked bond. And on the day that they issued it, they had already hit their targets that were due to be linked to the coupons, but they hadn't told people because they hadn't published those numbers yet. We're seeing companies change baselines without telling investors, so the baseline of the emissions for their targets. And so coming back to what we have to do as investors is, you know, we have to assess the whole company, assess what those proceeds are being used for, and understand whether it ties into the whole company's strategy and make an assessment based on that. So it's very important, again, to do your homework, to make sure that you're not just buying it because of the label. You're buying it because you believe that the whole company is doing something good.
Do you think there's a role for regulation or improved standards to help that? And thinking about from an investor's perspective as well, what you just explained, okay, that makes sense, but that's not always going to be apparent. A green bond is going to look like a green bond. So how can we try and move from that?
I think I was going to say actually the EU green bond standard is you know, has got good intentions as well to require additionality of the use of proceeds, to set better standards on the reporting. I think there's always a danger that people try and, you know, fit their way into a particular box in order to raise more capital. But I think, you know, promoting that additionality as a core principle of green bonds, I think will help the market gain credibility, definitely.
Okay, super, thank you. And Elisa, just coming to you, picking another topic. So I see a lot of our peers had a lot of talk about using engagement from a net zero perspective, and I just wondered, as a strategy for a key part of net zero, and I just would be interested to get your view on how that's typically used, how sort of engagement and stewardship is used, but also the effectiveness of that. And I suppose what I'm getting at is I do see engagement often used as a bit of a panacea, that it's going to solve everything, whereas actually I'm not sure that's the case. And coming back to this kind of actual real world outcomes, is it really having a real world outcome? So over to you.
I would say engagement is not for every type of investor, but for long-term investors, it seems kind of appropriate because they will be there for a long time. So it would make sense to align their demands of a company with their investment horizon. So institutional investors, they have a good position to engage because of the volume they represent and because of their investment profile. I wouldn't say engagement is for a small person like me who would go and invest in a fund, but historically, big institutional investors have been those having a voice with divestment.
Sorry.
With divestment in the beginning, with the religious exclusions and everything. And I think, bless you, don't worry. And I think now we have realized that divestment was doing more harm than good. actually, in some cases. So the ideal strategy would be to own your ownership in that company and try to press to make your demands be heard, usually through like someone who would be uniting, for example, all Swiss pension funds voices, because the matters are usually very, very specific, and you are managing a pension a mutual fund, you usually don't know the specifics of each company in each sector. So usually you would be addressing your local, in Switzerland it's called ethos, and they would be doing that for you. So I want to say that it does make sense, and things happen because of those engagements.
Do you think there's, excuse me, sorry, I've got a really annoying cough. Do you think sometimes there's some overstatement of the effectiveness of that? So coming back to the theme of doing more harm than good, do you think there's a tendency in some instances to actually overstate the power of that?
No. Compared to, no. Maybe no. I think what happens is that big companies get a lot of attention, and small cap usually navigate the waters without much, light on their face. But so if you're a big company, you will be having a lot of different activist groups telling you why this doesn't work, what you should be doing, which is great. But what we see is that for small companies, no one really cares that much, if I may say.
Okay. Virginia, I'm going to move on to you to another similar topic. So we see, again, coming back to this theme of more harm than good, we see some products with quite aggressive decarbonisation claims, where they're actually using long or short strategies. It'd be good to get your view on this, again, because you probably see a wider view of the market, but also what the actual impact, real-world impact of these kind of long-short strategies are from a decarbonisation perspective.
The impact is very good looking on the paper. Managers of those funds will claim that divesting or shorting this company will send a very powerful signal to the worst performing companies. That's true. But I have two, major caveats. The first one is that everybody should be aligned in shorting this company at the same time, because if not, then there will always be a buyer, and there is no transfer of, there is no effect on the price whatsoever. And the second one, which is, in my view, more important, is that if you short a company, you should not discount CO2 emission from your fund, because the CO2 is emitted. So you cannot, to make your fund look better, discount that from the overall emission of your fund. And that's a very important thing. Most of the time, the transparency about this is not present, and investors fail to understand how it works. So I think, in my view, the effect is on the real emission is not non-existing.
And given that, do you think that is actually doing more harm than good, or is it just a mechanism? It's just an outcome of the strategy rather than necessarily causing harm?
Well, it's actually distracting investors from doing things more important with their money allocation, I would say. So yes, it is doing more harm than good.
Tom, you look like you
Well, I was just going to say, that's a perfect example. If they can discount the emissions of the companies they're shorting, you could, in theory, quite easily create a carbon neutral portfolio that's invested in a lot of fossil fuel companies, but shorting more fossil fuel companies, and tell your clients that it's net zero. I think that's a perfect example of creating a data point that's maybe quite easy to read, but terribly misleading as to the underlying impact that the investment's having. So, yeah, I think that's definitely doing more harm than good, I would say.
Thank you. Carlo, just coming to sort of more of a real assets kind of context, because I think broadly this is more of a public markets situation, I suppose we've been talking about. Can you bring to life how real assets can be used to deliver change from a carbon or even a nature-based perspective, actually? And yeah, just really explain the role how nature-based investments can be used in a real assets perspective to deliver change, but also how that can fit within a wider climate strategy. And also, if you can talk about perhaps some of the innovation going on in that field as well, would be really helpful.
Thank you for this question. I think it gives me the opportunity to talk about something a little bit overlooked within real asset. I mean, the typical answer to your question would be absolutely correct, legitimate infrastructure, and for NBS or NCS, we would say wetland, green sea walls, absolutely needed. But sometimes we tend to forget the role of real estate. Can I give you just two figures to understand what I'm talking about? 70% of Europeans live in big cities. 75% of our buildings are not green efficient, and 95% of those buildings will stay with us on and after 2050. And 40%, I think, of emissions come from, at least in Europe, come from buildings. So there's a lot to do on building in terms of retrofitting, but also during the design phase, which is key. And in terms of innovation and NBS, there's a lot we can do during the design phase. To start with, I would say use more biomaterial, clay, tall timber, green steel, having it helps. Second point will be to use what engineers call cradle to cradle, so modular compounding, which helps a lot to save emissions. Design the building, as they say, using a technology called BIM, that basically it's a sort of see the asset, the building as a material banks. So in other words, in plain English, when I tear it down, how can I use this material? And last but not least, produce energy on site, no? Heating pumps, etc. We can also do a lot during the usage. I would say extend the life of an asset helps. Second, use green technology. It's now it's available. We often think and design an office as an office to be used during the day, right? And the night, the flat to be used during nighttime. But now it's absolutely possible with smart ventilation system to transfer heating or cool during the night from the office when you basically don't need to the flat, so huge energy. Another little, but I mean, if I say it's a little count, is Internet of Things. Modern buildings now have this control of temperature, heating by infrared, so if the room is empty, there's no need to help. And that has a lot. And in general, to come to your point, a natural-based solution, green roof for planting trees on the roof absolutely helps to control storm water, manage a lot heat waves, and also abate pollution. Hard to believe, but it's true. I mean, the most important one for me is the heat control. The green roof, because of CO2 role of plants, etc., tend to naturally cool, are as efficient, the roof as well, are as efficient as standard one. And in Europe, in Switzerland, from this point of view, are quite at the front of the pack. 86 million square meter roof are green, so that helps a lot. And also it's good for biodiversity, and probably, I think the role that finance should have also good, I've seen a lot of studies, mental and health issue to avoid the urban heat island effect that is particularly strong where cooling is more needed. Think of in India, 5% of population has access to cooling, and it's a huge also problem at macro and micro level. So there's a lot to come to your point. There's a lot we can do in retrofitting and when we build it, because buildings are a big part of the problem, often overlooked because of infrastructure. We always will be, that will be needed. But yes, there's a lot we can do.
Well, Swiss pension funds are massively invested in real estate, and the larger ones are actually measuring CO2 impact of their portfolio, including real estate. And the huge question for them is, how can I plan and finance refurbishment of the real estate ground, because there is a shortage of workforces to do that.
Okay, short workforce, obviously, I guess is beyond the discussion of today. We will go too far in terms of politics and far. Usage, I mean, I think, I'm not an engineer, but the modular buildings help to save 50%, the tall timber, that on top of that, that was my engineer son told me, using a green steel tall timber not only is good for the environment, it's also cheaper, and reduce the time for building. So it's also good from an economic point of view. So you're all positive. Green roof as well. Now the price are comparable to a standard one, and you save on cooling, which is absolutely good for money, for environment. There are now some credit from the Confederation when you do this kind of heat pump, green heat pumps, when you reduce some photovoltaic. So there are now some. It's a priority for the Confederation because it might be wrong, but they want to be net zero 2050, which roughly means, I might be wrong, 10, 11 kilos CO2 per square meters. That's what they have in mind. Very, very large. I mean, it's take like that. So there is an effort from the Confederation, but mostly there is an effect in the long term. You must reduce operational costs and attract, let me say. I don't have any studies for Switzerland, but in the UK, there is a, can I say, a greenium, sort of premium, not all on the asset, also on the tenant. You can price a little bit high in the office, which is green, because some big corporation can only rent efficient building. And by the way, if you don't do it for good today, but soon will be by the law. In France, I think in the UK as well, by 2030, you cannot rent anything before below EPC of B. So you care not, you either you care or you don't. That's in 2030 will be the law. So you are managing your transition risk, because doing the estimate will be difficult, attracting probably better tenant, and you can price on it because they also save. Sometimes you can split the bill in terms of less consumption. This is obviously in the long term, obviously in the medium long term.
Can I just weigh in on building materials? Because as you say, buildings as a sector is around 40% of global emissions if you include the entire life cycle, from the materials to the use of the buildings to the demolition. So it's quite a big theme for us in our portfolio as well. And if you take building materials, you know, unfortunately, it's not like fossil fuels where there are alternatives that are often cheaper. You know, the world is urbanizing. As you mentioned, a lot of the buildings we have today are not fit for net zero 2050. So we need to refurbish them. The world is urbanizing. So we need these materials. We need to invest in the companies that are innovating in that space. So if you take a local company here like Holcim, you know, this name in a lot of equity and credit indices is one of the largest emitting companies, because obviously the heat that's required to produce cement and the chemical process itself releases CO2. So it's often a very easy name to exclude from a portfolio because it has high emissions. But you know, this is a company that's innovating, you know, spending billions on looking at carbon capture technology to reduce the CO2 at the point of
Clinker
production. Clinker, you reduce clinker content. They're selling more of their eco-packed cement, which has 30% lower emissions intensity. And also companies like Saint-Gobain, you know, innovating with net zero glass, looking at lighter materials to replace heavyweight materials. So, you know, these are companies that, unfortunately, we need these materials, so we need to support the companies that are innovating, give them capital, and actually, if you pick the right companies, they'll become market leaders in these spaces and actually gain market share. And so we think, you know, you can benefit as an investor and support climate transition, but you have to accept maybe that your scope 1 and 2 emissions might be a little bit higher.
Can I have a question for you that are more on the market?
I'm just going to go now. I'll see you later.
Sorry. Let's take a generic intense company, whatever sector, could be steel, could be cement, etc. You invest because of the right reason. You say we need those companies in the future, etc. Do you apply any KPI in plain English? Okay, I invest in you, oil producer, cement, I invest in you in steel, but in 3 years I want to see a reduction of CO2, I want to see less intensity energy. In 5 years I want to see that, or just...
Yes. I mean, we do basically. I mean, and it's very region and company specific. So, you know, we look at what best practice is available in that market. We look at the technological pathways. So there's some industries that just can't really decarbonize yet. You look at like industrial gases, for example, hugely reliant on natural gas. There's not really an alternative yet. But we looked at a chemical company recently that was already moving away from coal and gas to use local sustainable biomass, and then a much lower intensity version than the synthetic version of this fuel. So it was a soda ash producer in Turkey. So yeah, we're very much, we will look for the best practice for that company, and we will continuously engage with them to make sure that they are following that. And there could be reasons that they're not meeting the targets this year. I mean, obviously, in the last 5 years, we've had a war in Europe, we've had pandemic. So, you know, there are some circumstances that have put companies off track, but certainly, yeah, we keep a close eye on them.
Divesting to increase cost of capital is your last weapon, your last resort.
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
If I may say this. Thank you.
Perfect, thanks. I'd actually like to come back to the last part of my previous question, and just focusing on nature. I know you talked about nature-based solutions in a real estate context, but it would be, if you can, or if anyone else has a view, just talk about what kind of opportunities there are to invest in nature as an actual an asset class in itself, if you like. I'm thinking sort of forestry, peatland, that kind of thing. I know, Carlo, if you have anything you can bring to that, or not.
Well, as you said, I mean, you can do good investing in lots of sectors. From time of, it was in a more natural solution, etc. Partially, CERN has been investing in forests for decades, probably even before I was born, and unfortunately was not recent, because for a lot of reasons that date back to traditional economic analysis, capture inflation, local relation. Now, new possibility of revenue in terms of carbon offsetting. And also, I believe that they also play an important role in terms of CO2 sink. So that's one example, but there are lots of funds, Article 8 or 9, where you can probably have a natural-based invest. I mean, I think they know far better than me. But from this point of view in Europe, I wouldn't say that we are, the regulation helps a lot. I mean, the taxonomy, I mean, just to give a call a name, it helps a lot. When you see Article 8, 9, you see there's a certain high degree of certainty.
Okay.
I mean, I would love to have the opportunity to invest in more nature-based solutions. For us, the challenge is always that agriculture and nature-based solutions have such a range of outcomes, so that it can go from being a massive solution to climate change if it's done in the correct way, you know, regenerative planting, no monocultures, you know, organic, and so on. Whereas if you go the other end, it can be a massive source a massive cause of climate change if it's done in the wrong way. And it's quite hard as investors, unless we're investing directly in the asset, which you know, if you're doing real assets, you'll be able to see them in the flesh. But if we're looking at like a forestry REIT in the US or pulp and paper manufacturer in Latin America, it's quite hard for us to assess the quality of those nature-based solutions. And so it's a difficult area for us, but we are investigating it as time progresses.
Probably more to come. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, we have a few clients who have agriculture as an exclusion criteria. So then when we present them like positive impact agricultural funds, they have a constitutional problem. You know.
Okay, and why do they have that? Is that because they're concerned about the impact of
traditionally bad, like you said? So they put this in the exclusion criteria together with coal and, you know, weapons and those things. And when they come across a positive impact agricultural fund, it's agriculture, so. Yeah.
Those are all mitigation investment, right? Because adaptation, unfortunately, I guess, is difficult to propose to a client, I guess. Yeah, it's difficult to find.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. It was just you kind of answered my question, Tom. What I was trying to get at is, from a carbon perspective, you know, there's often a return on that investment. You know, when you're investing in energy efficiency, you can see a reduction in that demand. And I was trying to see if there was something similar from a nature perspective, which it's clearly early days, but I think that's how we can drive more investment in that sector. Okay, super. Well, I'll move on to the next question. This is something I spend a lot of my time on, and it's probably the bane of my life. Well, this and my second question, actually, but anyway, is data. And interestingly, none of you have touched on data at all, or the challenges of that, so I'm going to force you to. It'd just be really interesting to get your views on some of the challenges around data, why it's a challenge, and just what we can do as an industry to try and resolve that. I'll start with you, and then actually when we get to you, Carla, if you can really bring to life the challenges from a real estate context, because it's quite different in real estate than it is, say, in a corporate setting. But yeah, Lisa, it'd be good to get your views.
Yes, thank you. So regarding data, I agree with what Virginie said in the beginning, that what I see, what stops my clients from going further is fear of doing, something wrong, of being accused of not having their priorities in order. But what I see in the future, I know this might be an unpopular opinion, but I see ESG scores will kind of fade away, and we will be having this climate alignment. I don't know if it would be this net zero, or how are we going to call it? Maybe we will measure it in degrees, or we will see. And on the other side, maybe controversies, just to really avoid the big issues. But for me, this is the new data I want to see is not a better ESG score, because ESG, we know it comes from past reported data. It's not measurable. We can't compare it in the future, like from 5 years of the company. So where I would like to see the efforts really is with this climate alignment, so net zero or another metric, and controversies to really avoid, I don't know, child labor. It has to, yeah.
Yeah, but it's also having that more forward-looking.
Absolutely.
Not
yeah.
to child labor.
Only, I don't even care about the past anymore.
Tom, I mean, that's kind of what the Transition Bond Fund's trying to do, is actually look into the future. How much of a challenge for you is data?
Yeah, well, I think, like Elisa, I would distinguish between objective data points that are just measuring something, so say CO2 emissions, or whether the company has a target in place, or whether, what its approach to biodiversity is or something, versus subjective scores. So I think the former does a lot more good, because the more information we have on a company, the better decisions we can make. And we use a lot of data providers. There's an alphabet soup of different ESG data providers out there, and we have to sort of navigate our way through that jungle. But it's very important to us. But what we do shy away from is scores. And I think temperature scores, I mean, when coming back to the question, doing more harm than good, we looked at I won't name the data provider, but the temperature scores that they were putting out early on, and they came to us with a sort of prototype data, and Tesla had a score of 3.6 degrees, and a lithium miner had a score of over 4 degrees. So both, Tesla, pure electric vehicle company, lithium miner, a material that's essential to decarbonizing the economy, well over 3 degrees, and Shell had a temperature score of 2.1 degrees, and it was because under the formula, it's does it have a target by 2050? Does it have a policy in place? And Shell can work its way through those things, and it's true that they do have long-term goals, but then if you think about capital allocation, you're going to build more money into a company like Shell versus company that's aligned with net zero, or even consistent with the materials that we need for decarbonizing the grid. So for me, data is very important, but we need to be careful when it's scores and when there's a lot of information behind it, because we want to understand that.
Do you think there's a role for more regulation in that specific space of data and rating? Actually, once you've answered as well, if you could all pick up on the same point as well in terms of regulation and data in that context. I
think requiring more disclosure from companies can only be a good thing for investors. Obviously, for companies, it's a pain, but so I think CSRD, I think there's a role to push companies to disclose more. Regulating the sort of power of the different ESG score providers, I think that is something that should be looked at, but it's challenging. I don't really have a solution for it, but I think it should probably be
if you did,
investigated.
Perfect. And Virginie?
Well, there are two basic aspects with data. The first one is reported data, and I think they should be as transparent as possible, as regulated, as standardized as possible. And then you have the data you use to make your own assessment, to build your own methodology. And if you are transparent, if you're willing to be open source and explain how you build that, I think there is no problem in having different point of view. The problem we are struggling with, and you touch upon that, is the cost. Because cost of data to base a very good investment decision in order to decarbonize our portfolio are extremely high. And it becomes a problem.
Yeah, it is, and it can actually be a barrier to actually making decision making, because it's like, I'd like that data, but I'd have to spend £1 million on a subscription, so I won't have that data.
Exactly.
Yes, it's a challenge.
So should there be a common good?
Well, possibly there should be. Whether there will be, I suspect not. But and yeah, Carlo, just from real assets, and as I said, in particular real estate, you know, the difference between scope 1, 2, and 3, and how that plays out, I think will be quite interesting, just to expand a little bit.
The use of data, right?
Yeah.
I think in general it's a big issue for us. For example, I mean, we could talk about a lot of this, but one that I see quite often, it's a problem itself. For example, ESG rating. I mean, there are lots of studies and the real practical example that most of divergence about ESG ratings come from not different or legitimate different opinion from the analysts, but underlying data. That's a big problem. If you look at, we did a couple of times, correlation between the same company but different service providers is very low, 0.3, 0.4. All these that might look academic means that ESG performance is not fully reflected in equity and bond price. Problem. It's a problem for the company that you are engaging, because basically they tell you, okay, I work hard to improve, but the market doesn't listen to me. What for? And also when you do your studies, just the choice of service provider may lead to different results. And this is not an academic issue, just if I won't name it, but the very famous, for example, electric car producer, for FTSE is very bad, Marital very, very bad. For MSCI it's quite high, for a simple reason that they don't disclose very much. Everything that goes beyond factory gate is not disclosed. For one, it's okay. Okay, you give us this is good. We don't care about the other. For other one, say, okay, we can use it. So there are lots of other companies. So imagine someone has to take a financial decision on the same company where one rating is quite the lowest, one rating is quite the highest. So we risk maladaptation. Without good data, we risk maladaptation. That's for sure. And the problem is huge, as all said, from us on the market, from empirical research, companies that are engaged, because honestly, they want to see recognized by the market. So ESG rating, it's a problem on top of the others that they mentioned.
Can I just say, obviously, we're all aware as well there's huge data gaps, and something that, again, coming back to more harm than good, we don't want to be restricted to only investing where the data is. So this is where the kind of research-driven, active approach plays in, because we have the resources to go in and look for those companies that don't have an MSCI score, don't have a science-based target, but actually, doing lots of good things. Might be a pure play renewable power company in India, or a high yield company in the US that's maybe not got the same standard of ESG reporting, but actually is a very strong climate change investment. And I think also as investors, we can benefit from that, because the companies that have, the greenest scores, the highest scores, those are the ones that a lot of money is already gone towards. And the greenium is quite high there, right? Because they're just the classic green stories that everyone's invested in. We'd prefer to try and uncover those stories that are, the green stories of tomorrow, right? Encourage them to improve their reporting and benefit as investors as more investors discover them.
How do you do that? I mean, I need to open up to the floor, but I'm just interested to know. So, in the absence of an MSCI data set, for example, in those instances, how do you get comfort?
Yeah, well, we have a team of analysts that cover different sectors around the world, and because people are aware of this product and aware of our focus on climate change, if there's an idea or a company that looks like it's involved in something that might be of interest, either because the transition story is strong or they're involved in a particular solution, a climate solution, then we, that triggers something and we go and do some more work. We often have to engage with the company to get more information, and so it's really just done by the groundwork of trawling through the companies that we cover and then doing the research ourselves.
Okay, perfect. So we've only got 5-10 minutes left. I do have some more questions, but it'd be great to see if there's any questions from the floor for any of the panelists. Your hand that went up first, so I'll go with you. I don't know. Try pressing a button and see what happens.
Yes, thank you for the discussion.
I think you might have switched. Is that working?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I'm Barbara. I work for a think tank focused on financial inclusion in developing economies. I'd like to come back to the S in ESG, and thank you for mentioning adaptation. It seems to be not very present in the discussions on climate investment, so maybe two questions. One is, do you observe any trade-offs in your investment portfolios between the E and the S? And how do you deal with that? And then what needs to happen for adaptation to be better investable and be more present in investment portfolios? Thank you.
If I can relate on what we have, the kind of discussion we have with pension fund, once they start considering ESG sustainability, they have a lot of questions about S. And most of them say, for the time being, we will favor E, so climate-related investment, because we have a number of data that are available. To go back to what I said at the beginning, it's because they fear doing the wrong thing. So if they had more data and more investment related to S dimension, I think they will go to that direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important question for us. I mean, we don't want to invest in a climate change idea that's involved in forced labor or where the just transition's not being considered either. So if we're looking at a big company that's changing its operations, transitioning, we want to make sure that they do have a plan in place for their workers and that they're making sure that people aren't left behind. Also things like, I mentioned a renewables company in India, we're looking at the land rights there so that they're not buying land and taking it from local people in a way that's not fair. So we certainly consider social risks. And actually, on the other question, adaptation is actually a pillar of our climate transition bond fund. We agree with you in the sense that it is very underinvested, underappreciated at the moment. And I think that's partly because it's quite difficult to grasp. We've found some strong ideas in the water space, so water companies across the globe that are very involved in better water preservation for drought-prone areas and also more resilient infrastructure for increased storms and floods. So we are looking at adaptation, and I think what's needed is just better disclosures from companies. If the companies can disclose their physical risks better, then we'll start to be able to identify those that are dealing with it in a better way.
Thanks. There's a question in the lady corner.
Good morning. My name is Tulin, and I work for the International Fund for Agricultural Development. My question related to the data, do you see any future expansion for artificial intelligence to play a wider role when it comes to improving your data collection on the ESG?
Go for it. Tom, you moved.
I flinched, yeah. Of course, I mean, if we can use artificial intelligence to make better decisions, better investment decisions, to use data in more efficient ways, I think we should. I think there's always a danger with artificial intelligence of the sort of black box problem. We might not know exactly how the underlying model is working. So I think we would proceed with caution there, but there's so much data out there, and if we can use it to help predict which companies are actually doing more good for the planet, then I think we should be. But it's not something that we're very advanced with yet, because I think it's still very early stages. Yeah.
Probably, I guess, some expertise. Also adding qualitative part, reading 100 TSVD reports that are qualitative long, that could be something. I guess question. Yeah,
I think so. Yeah. Lots of potential.
Okay, any more? The person at the back in the black t-shirt.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Hi. I'm Giorgio. I'm a researcher at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. And first of all, thank you for the panel. I'm glad to hear that there's some distrust in ESG scores, because that's also what we're seeing in the research. First of all, I just wanted to ask, when I look at the title, one thing that comes to mind is trade-offs between climate and biodiversity. And I was curious to hear what your experience, what you have seen when you're like focusing on climate investments and what the impact is on biodiversity. I'm thinking, for example, of mining happening in the Amazon or biofuels and monocrops. And second thing, I was curious to hear a bit more about your, how you see impact coming from investments in secondary equity markets. You talked a little bit about engagement, but yeah, I was curious to see how you see your investments in good companies. Are they really having an impact if you don't engage? Or because eventually, when you're buying shares, you're just giving capital to people who are other investors who were owning the shares before.
Who wants to say that? Yeah.
So I would say for biodiversity, sadly, I am not seeing universal metrics. You know, climate change, we know it's greenhouse gas, and we've all been hearing it for a long time now, and we can kind of measure it. For biodiversity, I feel like each fund we come across, we need to get into their concept of biodiversity. How are they looking at it? What metrics? Every time it's a new biodiversity, if I may say. Let's give it time. But for instance, at the moment, I think climate change is still the battle, and then I know biodiversity is more catastrophic even, but I think it's just too far away. So we don't react until it's too late, like very, very late. So I think it's going to be a few years.
Just to pick up on the question though, so is there a trade-off though of to use the example, and this is to everybody, that you're investing in lithium, for example, which is great. Okay, there's the social risks as well, but actually are there biodiversity risks which perhaps not being considered in that context? Again, open question. Tom, you're moving the most.
Yeah, I mean, it's true, but I think the two objectives are, one, mitigating climate change will also mitigate biodiversity loss, and actually protecting biodiversity will also help mitigate climate change. The problem is measuring it. I mean, at the moment, biodiversity is such a local, hyper-local issue. The number of species within a different region is very difficult to assess. I think at the moment, companies are starting to mention it more, but that's basically, from what I've seen, a picture of a squirrel in their ESG report. It's very, very early stages. We are seeing some more innovative companies that are actually setting targets, but how strong they are, it's hard for us to assess at the moment. So we try and incorporate it into our process. Well, we do, but it's limited by the data of our portfolio companies.
I mean, obviously, at corporate level, I totally agree what you said, but at the government bonds level, there's something a little bit is moving. There are a few indexes, one from WWF, that incorporates biodiversity in their government bonds. I think Seychelles a few years ago issued their first blue bonds. So there are some way of adding financial return to a specific biodiversity, typically at government bond index or country emission level. Something little is moving from that side.
Okay, we've got time for, I think, like a really quick question. We'll go for the person at the back who is super fast.
I just wanted to comment on that implied temperature rise example. I felt very compelled to comment because I was the guy who created that data. I just wanted to say two things. First of all, I wanted to give you an update. We have completely understood that some of the early results of implied temperature rise were very non-intuitive. So first of all, the reason for that was because at the time, we didn't have a comprehensive Scope 3 data set, and we have that now. And you can imagine that especially car companies and oil companies suffer in the analysis if you don't have that. But creating it for 10,000 companies is really, really difficult. So number two, one thing that we've changed is we're testing the data against the intuition that 400 analysts are giving us. And as it stands right now, 74% of all companies, the model predicts exactly what analysts are saying. And 0.3% of companies are like kind of backwards. So what I'm trying to say is, we've understood what the issues with the early versions of the models are, and we've, tried to improve over 7 iterations. Okay. But there's a second point that I'd like to make, which is, I think, more important. As the providers that produce these scores, I think there's a misunderstanding. And the misunderstanding is that the modelers, I think the perception is that the modelers create something and that the whole financial industry needs to eat exactly that score. We never said that. We never ever said that. We are providing 7,000 different modules, parts of that score. And we agree that there's not a single way to aggregate. So if you don't like our way of aggregating, which is just our house view, then please use the modules. And we're totally fine with that. We understand that there's a wide diversity of views. But it's very difficult as a data provider to communicate that. Because as soon as the score is out, everybody thinks, this is the ground truth. So we're driven by the market to produce simple stuff. But when the simple stuff arrives, people criticize us and say, well, how can this be? And I just wanted to comment on that. And that's all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So not a question, but you've ably filled the remaining minute we had. So on that note, I'll wrap it up. So I just want to say thank you to Carlo, Virginie, Thomas, and Elisa. And if you could all join me in a round of applause for the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.